Welcome, everybody, to the second installment of our series on community sovereignty. We have the great pleasure of having a gentleman that is a giant in legal affairs when it comes to protecting citizens' rights in the face of government overreach, and that is Mr. Mike Rose, attorney at law who represents the plaintiffs in the lawsuit against the city of Aiken. So it's really good. Let's dive right into it.
My name is Mike Rose. I'm an attorney who lives in Somerville, and I represent a group of citizens and organizations in Aiken who opposed what's known as Project Pascalis in Aiken due to what we believe to be various violations of law by the city of Aiken and its various subdivisions with regard to that project.
So explain what is Project Pascalis real quick, as best you can, and then why was there a challenge to what they were trying to do?
Well, it's a hotel retail complex that was going to be built in historic Aiken. And in order to build it, it was going to result in the demolition of historic Hotel Aiken and the movement of some retail businesses like a dry cleaners and the shutting down of streets. So I think Newberry Street, but it was going to reconfigure downtown Aiken in a way to make way for this new project. And citizens objected to it, an organization objected to it, because number one, they didn't think the Hotel Aiken needed to be demolished. It could be refurbished, but it would be better for the community to retain it because of its historic value. And they wanted any project to be downsized so it didn't shut down these retail businesses and interfere with usage of the public streets.
So, people who get concerned, they always, about things and legal issues and legal methods, they always hire an attorney to come in and try to help if they can do that. But also, attorneys can choose what they decide to get involved in. Why was it that you chose to take this sort of thing on? What is happening in the state to see this as an important thing you wanted to be involved in and help with?
Well, I've always, throughout my adult life, have been interested in using the law to hold the government accountable. For example, I'm the named plaintiff in the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision and the Freedom of Information Act, a 1976 decision. You can Google Department of the Air Force versus Rose, and which I brought as a student and editor of New York University Law Review when I was writing a Law Review article in the early 70s. And that decision established redaction as a precedent. So the Freedom of Information Act came into existence in 1974. Now in 1976, the Supreme Court ruled that the government could not withhold a document because somebody's name is in it. They had to redact it and furnish the document.
That's the point. That's the redaction thing. You can release it if the names are redacted.
Yes.
Or something. Okay.
Now, if it had gone the other way, the government would put somebody's name on every document and nobody would get anything. So for whatever reason, at an early age, I started using the law to make the government accountable. And I became a state senator. I served 13 years, South Carolina, representing Dorchester, Berkeley, and Charleston County.
Well, thank you for your service.
Thank you. I'm a graduate of the Air Force Academy, New York University Law School, and Harvard Business School. So I have a business, legal, military, and political background. And in the town of Somerville, where I now live, a project similar to Project Pascalis was being created about 5 years ago. And I and another lawyer, Andy Gowder in Charleston, sued the town of Somerville and effectively stopped the project. The cost of the project doubled in just 1 year, but we found various violations by their Board of Architecture Review, which is like the design review board of Aiken, and by our Somerville Municipal Commission, and by the town itself and by the Planning Commission by just researching the state statutes and the town ordinances to determine what was required. We saw that these town of Somerville officials were violating certain provisions and not doing things they should. So we sued, and we went through discovery by getting documents and emails and taking depositions, and found out the law violations were much more massive than we thought. Violations of the Freedom of Information Act, secret meetings, out of the purview of the public, and so forth. And I wound up with Andy Gowder bring another lawsuit. So we've sued our county, we've sued our town, we're suing our school district. We won a year or so ago, 5-0 in the South Carolina Supreme Court, a decision against our county. And that sets a precedent, for example, that every municipality, every county, every public service, every school district, if they put on a referendum to be voted on whether to finance projects, they have to be voted on one by one instead of as one just big package. So you just can't say, we're going to have a referendum whether we're going to spend millions of dollars for parks and libraries. You've got to have a separate vote on parks and a separate vote on libraries.
So no omnibus type of bill.
No omnibus thing. So that's an enormous precedent. That means forever that all these government entities are not going to let some weak project be on the ballot that wouldn't pass on its own to be carried, to be passed because it's attached to a strong project. Everyone's going to be voted on one by one. So this is an example of using the law to hold the government accountable and to shape through interpretation and judicial orders, interpretation of ordinances and statutes, shape the behavior of government officials. Now, what's happened here in South Carolina, you've got all these people moving here from up north in the Midwest, partly because people are retiring, partly because of the weather, partly because of COVID, partly because of the bad living conditions in blue states. And with all this influx of people, there's money to be made in real estate. So like in some parts of the country, you've had gold rushes, you've had silver rushes. Well, this is a real estate rush. So if whoever's building or having anything to do with the real estate development makes money. So, and it turns out that South Carolina was like the Wild West. It was pretty much unregulated. From Maine to Florida, every state except South Carolina 15 years ago had what's called an adequate public facilities ordinance. So the town, even like towns like Alexandria, Virginia, would not allow a project to be approved unless the developer showed there was adequate sewer, water, roads, and schools to support the project. And if there wasn't, often there would be an option to let the developer use the developer's own money to build the infrastructure. Well, here in South Carolina, they just approved stuff and worried about the infrastructure later. So the schools got overloaded, there was flooding, there was congestion on the roads, and people got upset and pushed back. And then and so now we're behind on our infrastructure, and it costs money to build the new infrastructure. And then the question is politically who's going to pay for it. Like I like user fees. I like impact fees where people pay for the impact they create. But
okay, so let me interrupt real quick though. So you're saying South Carolina is unique among the other states in how it allows towns. I mean, do they have a centralized control system in these other states, or is it all how the towns do it?
I can't answer that accurately. I would say that when I started paying attention to this 15 years ago, I realized there was not an adequate public facilities ordinance I could find anywhere in the state.
Gotcha.
So I wrote one for Dorchester County.
Mm-hmm.
I got a councilman to introduce it. The biggest meeting I've ever seen in Dorchester County were all the realtors opposing it at the next meeting. They were out. They couldn't even get all into the room. So they don't want to be regulated because they want to build. They want to get their projects approved and build in order to make money. So now the citizens are pushing back because they realize their quality of their life's going down because, number one, their taxes are going up, and number two, they got congestion of their schools and other roads. And in Somerville area, we were literally having flooding. So there would be runoff from
giant parking lots built without any
parking lots
sense of where the water's
clear
going.
cutting all the trees and all this stuff, and there would be floods. So the quality of life's going down, the taxes are going up, and so generally, in other county, other parts of the country, on the east and west coast, there was more regulation to protect the citizens that were already there than in South Carolina. So when Somerville, down in the heart of Somerville, historic district, there was a project being promoted that the city contracted with a developer to build a hotel, condominium, conference center, parking garage complex. And it was 3 stories high, and on one side of a main street in downtown Somerville, it would be 330 yards long, continuous building. That's longer than a football field.
Mm-hmm.
So the Preservation Society, Taxpayers Association, numerous citizens were opposed to this. For one thing, it could not be built and be financially sustainable without the taxpayers giving significant subsidies. And there were just many flaws in the contract. And what the town literally did is they got rid of their town administrator and then let the new mayor serve as a town administrator, which that was illegal. We got another lawsuit on that. A mayor or a councilman can't be the fire chief or the police chief
they can't serve dual
or the
purpose.
town administrator.
Right.
So instead of having a professional town administrator being a check and balance on the town council, you had the mayor who admittedly didn't have the business acumen to do the real estate project, making the decisions. The town council turned everything over to the mayor. And the mayor made this deal, which we sued and we stopped. And
wow.
And imagine, and by the way, a year later, the developer sued the town for $8 million. So they're still in that lawsuit. So imagine with COVID coming, if this had been partially built and then there was a dispute over money, so the town and the developer are suing each other, and this partially built thing's right in the middle of the town. That very realistically could have occurred. Or even if it had been totally built, how many people are going to use some little new hotel downtown Somerville in the middle of COVID? Or even if it wasn't COVID. So, I mean, there were just too many risks to this, and more importantly, more law violations in our view. And as an example of the law violations, see, we were able through discovery in the lawsuit to get the emails between the town and the developer and among the town members. And what we saw is, okay, their Board of Architecture review would literally have scheduled back-to-back meetings. Instead of having a public meeting to discuss how the project was going to look, they'd have 3 Board of Architecture review members meet at one time with a developer, and then have immediately afterward a second meeting with 3 more members so that they could say there was no quorum and therefore it could be secret to decide what the design was going to look like. So this is an example of circumvention of the Freedom of Information Act by our town of Somerville, according to the lawsuit we've brought. So when Andy Gowder was approached about what was happening in Aiken and came to me, and Andy and I now represent organizations and individuals in Aiken who are suing about Project Pascalis. And here is the same general theme that the town officials, in our view, violated the law in creating the project. I mean, you don't select the developer or sign an agreement with the developer first and then later put out a request for a proposal. You're supposed to do the opposite, request for a proposal, and then among the people that responded, make your selection, as an example. So there's various multiple issues. Now, what's happened is when we sued, there were motions to dismiss filed, and the judge ruled about 2 weeks ago not to dismiss the case, to let it proceed. And this is a big fork in the road benefiting the plaintiffs. That means we can engage in discovery. That means we can take depositions. We can put town officials under oath, which we're going to do, and ask them questions, and they have to answer. And furthermore, we're going to obtain by subpoenas and in the lawsuit documents, all communications about Project Pascalis, all of them, all the emails, all the text, all the memos.
So let me ask you, I want to dissect some of this a little bit and to go into your opinions on why there's pushback on these type of activities, because many people believe that if you have a business district with 2-story buildings, and if a business district is about commercial development, then 4-story buildings are bigger and it adds to the tax base. What is the law these towns are breaking that y'all are bringing suit to that is contradictory to the concept of building up the community? How does what is that? Because that's one of the big confusions that a lot of people have.
All right. Well, I'll answer this in 2 ways. First of all, we got to separate the legal issues from the political issues.
Okay.
Okay. So there's state statutes and town ordinances that govern the procedures that have to be followed.
That the town has approved in the past.
The towns approve the ordinances,
right?
But it doesn't mean they follow the ordinances.
There we go.
And furthermore, it sets forth criteria. It's not just a procedure, but the criteria. How do you decide whether to do this or do that, or approve this or approve that? So, so that's the legal part. Now, if the law is followed with regard to the procedure, and even if it's followed with regard to the criteria, then it becomes the political issue of there's a cost benefit to whatever is being proposed, and it's just a political decision whether to incur the cost to get the benefit or not. So people have a right to lobby for or against something politically, but what we're focused on in the lawsuit is the legal part. And what happens is in some of these local governments, we have these, let's say, good old boys and girls, and they wind up, what's the words I would use? Let's say they might not be following the law, but they might have incentives to profit or benefit, or their friends profit or benefit by what they're doing. So it's not necessarily in the public interest, but instead might be in the interest of just certain people that benefit from their decisions. Now, they may not, I mean, no politician stands up and says, I got a lousy idea, I want you to support it. They always make it sound good. So they always spend it. They always say it's in the public interest. We see it on TV every night. This is on the public interest. In any event, if you got, so all over the state, there's municipalities, there's over 200 of them,
Mm-hmm.
and there's counties, and they can give and you got the state, so they can pass laws to allocate money, incentivize projects, and at the local level, give permits for projects.
And this is because the state has created enabling legislation to allow cities and counties to do this.
Well, the answer is yes, but see, a city and a county doesn't exist except the state.
That's right.
allowed it.
That's right.
So the Constitution creates the state government, and then the state governments pass enabling legislation to create or allow the creation of counties and cities and school districts and public service districts. All those are legally separate entities. All have their own elected or appointed governing board. They all make decisions, and the question is, and they're all limited by whatever the enabling statutes are.
Right, so the enabling statutes kind of create guardrails and say, okay, if you're an incorporated town, here's your room that you can work within by state statute.
That is correct. But see, there's additional statutes that create subdivisions of the counties or the cities, like a planning commission,
mm-hmm.
or a board of architecture review, which in Aiken is called the Design Review Board.
Right.
And then this Aiken Municipal Development Corporation or Commission, that's a separate statute. And in fairness, it's complicated. It's complicated. I doubt 1 in 100 lawyers know that body of the law. And I learned it by affiliated with a lawyer who does know it, Andy Gowder. He's on an American Bar Association committee, state and local governments. He was chairman of it that deals with these kind of issues around the country. And the Urban Law Institute, so he had a background in this. But I had to painstakingly study these statutes, these ordinances, and learn how they're interrelated and what they require. So in fairness, the average town council member, they're relying on their lawyers. And the lawyers, first of all, I mean, it's complicated.
It's complicated. So these council people, and I've dealt with a lot of councilmen too when I was and women when I was on Preservation South Carolina, standing up and advocating for some policy they were doing. And the vast majority of these people were really trying to fulfill their promise to make their community better.
Right.
And there is really a confusion in the understanding of the what makes things better. Is it just making buildings bigger? Is it just making new buildings? Or what all does that mean?
Well, the statutes and ordinances that are focused on preservation of historical buildings and sites have a lot of language that militate in favor of preserving what's there instead of replacing it.
Right.
Okay. So when you say, okay, we can increase our tax base, I mean, why don't we make it 10 stories high?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the more square footage, the more, that's true.
Which is the incentive of the governing body to bring in more tax base.
Right. But more is not necessarily better. So we brought all this stuff in. Now we got floods. Now we got congested roads. Now we got schools because we outstripped that are overcrowded because we outstripped our infrastructure. So let's start with more is not always better. But more to the point, the statutes put in place policies, requirements of preserving what's there when possible. So like this Hotel Aiken here, you can say, well, we're just going to demolish it and replace it and get something modern. But when you really get down to the ordinances and the written requirements, they're supposed to preserve it if possible. And they say, well, it's not feasible, it's not a good idea. Well, how do you know it's not? Did you have some expert look at it? Oh, you're expert. Oh, the person you chose. Okay. Well, what about this other expert that says, here's how you can preserve it? So what it comes down to is the governing body, if they're acting in good faith, will open-mindedly get expert input about whether the law, what the facts are, to make a decision based on the criteria set forth in the law. So if the criteria is you're supposed to preserve it if possible, now we got to determine whether it's possible. And how are we going to do that? Well, we on town council don't know whether it's possible. So are we going to? So we're going to investigate, and we're going to do what the law requires, not what we personally would prefer.
Well, and if I can interject, I mean, this is what I dealt with being the preservationist when I go in front of these town councils and planning commissions. There is unfortunately an inherent bias against folks talking preservation because people really don't understand the issues behind these old buildings. And we live in a throwaway culture where most folks think if it's dilapidated, well, with laissez-faire capitalism, it's dilapidated for a reason. It's not worth keeping. If it was worth keeping, it'd be alive. It'd be being used. If it's been empty 5 years, they just want to throw it away. And the thing that's most astonishing about that argument is how many times I see that as a planned obsolescence.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it's called demolition by neglect.
Yes.
And that is prohibited by law. So that's an example. Okay, let's just let it sit there. Let's let the weeds grow up. And it'll look so bad, we'll take pictures of it, and then we'll declare it's blighted. Okay? So, and then, therefore, we got to tear it down. We got to demolish it, and we got to replace it. Well, this sometimes is orchestrated.
Yeah.
So it's in bad faith. And actually, there's an obligation of the owner not to let it be demolished by neglect. So why isn't the town enforcing that requirement?
Well,
Like getting a court order to fix up the property, or like in Somerville, the town actually bought the property and it was the town that let it be demolished by neglect.
well, in regards to the Aiken Hotel, that's all I was hearing when I first came down. When some of the citizens, when I was still with Preservation South Carolina, that's all they were dealing with. The town saying it's too far gone. It's too far gone. We've had engineers say that it's too far gone. Well, first of all, for every 10 engineers that have been trained in modern engineering, there's probably maybe one that understands the structure of historic buildings and how they work. And so the first thing we did, we brought in a special engineer from Charleston who could come up and give an educated understanding of the masonry and everything. And while we were trying to get into the building, everybody was saying the building's too unsafe to go up into. So we did finally get permission to go in. We went up to the attic and we walked up on the roof after protestations that the roof was unsafe. Of course it wasn't. We got up there and there was a pond sitting on top of the roof that was probably several tons of water sitting on top of the roof that had been sitting there for months. And it was just astonishing that no effort at all was to try to clean that up. And the barrel that was underneath it catching the dripping water was just sitting there spilling everywhere that had been there for months. So that here, especially here in Aiken, that was a perfect example of doing that. Now, I'm convinced most of these folks didn't believe. They believed it was so far gone it wasn't worth the investment to fix those things. But unfortunately, that's a circumstance, that's self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
Well, let me tell you the irony of this is now it's very much in vogue to preserve what's historically been in existence, because that actually is more attractive to the public and is a better marketing device to attract people to your town. And let me give you an example. See, Aiken preserved its railroad station. Well, Somerville demolished its railroad station, and I think we regret that now. And we'd say, well, why did we demolish our railroad station? We had a railroad station like Aiken did. We could have converted that to something historic. In fact, we're now spending money to preserve historical structures in Somerville because of its attractiveness to the public. We could have had a railroad station just like Aiken. So you can have this hotel. This hotel will add more value, preserving the Hotel Aiken, ironically, more value to Aiken and enjoyment and attractiveness to the public than if you demolish it and build, I don't care what kind of you build, something modern is not going to be as attractive as something historical.
Well, it's not, but it's also another level. And this is where, when I talk about place, purpose, preservation, place is such a concept of importance to individuals because place tells the story. Place communicates the history in a way that people understand where they are and can tap into that. And there's a positive emotional reaction to that and the stories these places tell. So that's why they're so important. And Hotel Aiken is one of those places that help tell that story. And so the biggest challenge is how to convince, now this is the political thing, but how to convince folks that are trying to make these decisions to understand that you have to follow the money. And when you follow money in modern development, I want your thoughts on this, it appears to be more speculative short-term. You know, the real estate agents get a slice of whatever deal is made. So there's incentive to make the deal, whatever happens.
And move on.
Right. There's an incentive for developers to come in and build a building, but then do they retain ownership most of the time? It's mostly then sold out to a management company or other people to take responsibility for it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Actually, the first question that should be asked by any town or county councilman is what does the law require? Let's just start with that. Okay?
That's the basis of everything.
And I always say that two questions should be asked every government lawyer, every town, and not one, two. First is you can ask your question, like what does the law require? And then the second question is, what do you base that on? Because the answer to your question is no better than what it's based on. And often they don't know what it's based on. So is it legal for us to lump these two issues in one referendum item? Oh, yeah, sure it is. Now, they know, see, all these employed lawyers by the town already know over time what the majority of the council determines whether they keep their job want to hear. So I'm not saying they're dishonest, but I'm saying they got a bias. They got so if I can tell you no or I can tell you yes, and it could go either way, well then I'll tell you what I want you to hear type thing.
And plus, councils and administrations who have a certain bias for themselves, a certain sense of we want new development,
right,
will hire attorneys who walk in and agree, yes, and here's how we can do it.
That's right.
You know, and I really, after meeting a lot of these people, I really do believe the majority of the folks on the ground are trying to do what's best, but I don't think they understand their own bias in what they're willing not to hear and what they're shutting out.
Well, and it's just a political technique. So you ridicule the other side, you dismiss the other side, you don't listen to the other side. We structure it so the developer can talk for an hour about how good the project is, but now citizens can only talk 3 minutes each. And not only that, if it's the same thing that's redundant with what we heard the last 3 minutes, we're not going to let you talk anymore. So it's not balanced. Now, when I was a state senator, what I would do is ask somebody proposing a bill why they're for it, and then I'd ask, well, who's against it and why? And then I'd go to the people against it and ask them why they're against it. And I try to get balance here, what's the pros and cons, and then decide myself. But a lot of these council members are filtering out inputs contrary to their bias without realizing it. I'm not accusing them of being evil. I'm accusing them of being negligent.
Yeah.
And sometimes incompetent. So, and not even occurring to them. If our lawyer's sitting there and he would tell us if we're doing something wrong. No. The lawyer's not necessarily going to be telling you if you're doing something wrong. This is very complicated. You're spending a lot of money, and you better do it right. And see, that's where the values of the lawsuit is. What they learn is, you know what? We better not put our hand on that stove until we find out whether or not the burner's on. That we're liable to be sued if we don't comply with the law. So that's a real incentive. We don't want to be tied to another lawsuit. I don't want to give a deposition. I don't want to be embarrassed. So that helps shape behavior there. Now you got to know there's citizens out here, there's organizations that are going to watch everything you're doing. By the way, if you're trying to hide it and you're doing stuff behind closed doors and you're not discussing, if it's a real test, what you do is you go ahead, if you're serving your people, then tell them all you can. Let them know all the information and see what kind of feedback you get. But if you're going to hoard the information and the project's nearly completed or already approved by the people wake up to the fact that you're doing this, then you're just asking for pushback and anger, but now you can be asking for a lawsuit or lawsuits. So,
and the other thing too is their attorney tends to turn into their advocate in the sense of arguing their position and not necessarily digging into the law. Because I see that when we're having public hearings.
No, that's right. Number one, maybe they or their friends or their partners got some financial incentive to do it that way. That's point one. Point two, once they get a read that that's what a majority of the council want to do, who determines their job, well, then they got an incentive, even if they don't realize it, to tell them what they want to hear, what the council members want to hear. So they're an advocate. But then the council members are saying, well, we got a lawyer. If we were wrong, the lawyer would tell us. No, that's not necessarily true. And I cite the example. South Carolina Supreme Court rules 5-0 that you can't have libraries and parks as one vote, whether it's to approve millions of dollars of bonds to build both of them. You got to have two separate votes. But the lawyers kept telling the county of Dorchester County was okay. You can go ahead and put two together. Well, if you can put two, you can put 20 issues. Or how about 200?
So on the issue of now it took a judge and it took the legal system 8 months, I believe, to communicate to the town legally, you have to turn over all this stuff. Why did that take so long to do that?
Well, I don't think that's fair to the judge, and I'll tell you why. So when you bring a lawsuit, the lawyers have to, under the rules, have a reasonable basis for the lawsuit. So based on what they know, they file the suit. But then the other side comes back and either agrees or objects. And there were objections, and some of them we agreed to. It's like, oh, we didn't know that. If we had known that, maybe we wouldn't have added you. Or
because it's assumed when you're putting together a suit, you're really not talking very openly. So you kind of...
No, we're not talking... Well, maybe the citizens went to the council members, but the council members voted again and shut them down, and they're not interested in hearing them. So they, by the time they bring a suit, it's because they see it as a last resort.
Right.
Okay. So, but what I'm saying is there was a period before this ever got to the judge where motions are filed to... We filed discovery interrogatories. They objected and said, we want to move to dismiss. And then we decided, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we just mediate this? Maybe we can all agree. Because, look, right now, if the town agreed to that they did the stuff wrong and they won't do it again and the judge signed it in an order, then that's all we want. We're not going to get any money out of this.
Right.
So if we win, the judge may award attorney fees back to the people who paid, but they're not going to admit anything. They just they don't
just put up a wall.
They put up a wall, and maybe they're overwhelmed, maybe they're overloaded. But now see, the lawyers on the other side, they're getting paid to fight the suit, so they can file every motion, they can drag it out,
follow the money. So let me ask you this on the Freedom of Information Act, since you were so integral in that happening. Why is it still so hard to get these towns to turn over information? I mean, why do you have to file a Freedom of Information thing? Why can't they just be public?
Well,
on their website or whatever? Because I saw that here.
The law allows a citizen, requires the delivery of information under the Freedom of Information Act if you under its parameters. Okay. Now, some entities have a website, they put information on it, but they only spend so much time doing that. They can't put everything, I guess, on it. They have minutes. Freedom of Information Act requires minutes of meetings. They require notices of meetings, agendas to be published. So, but if it's controversial, it's a big ticket item that's involving money and the citizen might oppose, well, then there's just a tendency to minimize opposition by minimizing information.
Well, I was on a town council at one time, and I understand the propriety of having a contractual discussion with someone and having that insulated from outside influence when you're taking bids and meeting with contractors. So I understand the need to say, okay, this is something under executive session, and we'll release only when we come out and make our decision, and here's who we're doing. And I think that's a good thing. But that's where the issue comes and that's what they did here in Aiken, I believe. They just said, here's all this stuff that is under that proprietary kind of sense of executive session. And they just overreached on that, you think?
Probably, but I'm not certain how much they did or they didn't. We're going to find out in discovery. And one of the problems is we don't necessarily say, for example, we're allowed to ask them what did they discuss in executive session. Well, I can almost guarantee the lawyer is going to object, saying, no, that was executive session. Okay, but this is a lawsuit. you can't commit a crime or violate the law in executive session and be insulated from being accountable for it in this lawsuit. You got to tell us whether you discussed the wrong thing or not.
So if they did have executive session and did discuss the right thing, and y'all interviewed, and you say, oh, it is the right thing, that still means it's still protected. It's not public necessarily, right? It's within the shell of the disposition.
Well,
of the
it
deposition.
is. No, and unless they get a protective order from the judge,
It's open now.
then it's open. Right.
Okay.
Now, look, the state law defines what can and cannot be discussed in executive session. So a personnel matter can be discussed, litigation can be discussed in executive session, and contractual matters. That's it. You can't discuss something in executive session away from the public just because it's controversial, just because you know that people may not like your opinion. So that's supposed to be discussed out in the public.
Right.
See? So this is just an example, but one example is that if you're hoarding information from the public and you're in good faith as a councilman, then you should ask yourself, do we really, by the way, even if you're entitled to discuss it in executive session, you don't have to. I mean, you could discuss it publicly. All right. I mean, really, they could discuss all the project best counsel. Before we sign any contracts, before we put out a request for a proposal, we want public input. So we're going to have a workshop session. We're going to tell you what's being proposed, and we're going to tell you what the options. You could do it this way. You can make it bigger, smaller, taller, smaller, close this street, shut this down, not do that. Hotel Aiken, we could demolish or we could preserve it. And now we want an opportunity for the public to tell us what they think, okay? Now that would be, if you're really interested in serving your people that you represent. But a lot of council members have the attitude that they really don't have the attitude that they're serving the people, although they wouldn't acknowledge that necessarily, but that the people are to be avoided and they know better. And I'll give an example of this. In our lawsuit against Dorchester School District 2 over how they used $180 million of bond money by not having competitive bids, but instead doling out to who they personally selected the contract. A council member told me, well, Mike, I opposed what they were doing. I told them in executive session it was wrong. Well, then why did you vote for it? You told me it's wrong, you told them it's wrong. You're telling me that now, but you came out and voted to do it anyway. And her immediate answer was, well, I got to be a team player. And I said, wait a minute, you don't understand. They're not your team, we are. The citizens that elected you are your team. They deserve for you to vote publicly the way you honestly believe. And not only that, for you to explain why you voted that way. That I'm voting against it or for it for these reasons. That's what they deserve. You're telling me that you think pleasing the other council members, members of the school board, is your top priority because you got to be a team player for them. This is a mindset where this is the cause of a lot of this stuff. People just have an attitude where the constituents are problems to try to be avoided instead of humbly realizing that they're the very reason you exist.
Well, and I've being in those meetings and being on the side of the advocacy parts, I can understand seeing a culture of mistrust of what people are coming up and saying in those 3-minute things, because it's usually a small group of people who they're used to seeing come and complain. And I see that happening. And and I see them looking at these folks that are always there, and then having someone here that's saying, I'm going to invest $20 million in your community, and a successful businessman who through his education and through his wealth is able to be a lot more articulate than some of these folks who are passionate and not used to talking to a microphone. So it creates a culture of mistrust on these folks who just don't understand business. And I see that all the time, and
Right.
it's so frustrating.
Well, first of all, the devil's in the details.
Yeah.
So even if we have a generality like you're going to invest $20 million, the wording of the contract is what matters. So that's setting the parameters and splitting it. Let me give an example. So the Somerville contract has 2 indemnity provisions in it saying that they're going to build this hotel over what used to be a gas station.
Mm-hmm.
So it's got underground storage tanks. Okay. So now the town, under the contract that the mayor signed on behalf of the town with the developer, is indemnifying the developer against any loss due to environmental damage due to those gas tanks in the gas station.
Meaning developer's not responsible.
That's right. Well, he's not taking a risk. The town's taking a risk. Well, it's absolutely unconstitutional. Absolutely. Well established for any government agency to give an open-ended indemnity provision to a private entity or person. So you can't just say, I mean, what if there was $1 billion worth of damage? You just can't open-endedly make the taxpayer liable with an indemnity provision, but they did it anyway. Their lawyers should have told them that's illegal.
Well, that's what we see, and I don't know if it was an active indemnity issue in contracts, but I see it all the time where an old mill outside of a town or inside a town, the mill's not been used for 20 years, and somebody comes along and says, I'll clean this mill up and I'll sell the bricks and everything, and whatever agreement they do, they allow them to do it, and then all of a sudden you have a brownfield and the town is stuck with multi-million-dollar damages in a brownfield. Greenwood had to deal with that with their big mill downtown, and it cost the taxpayers millions of dollars so one guy can sell bricks for 50 cents a piece to Charleston.
Right. And just the first time I read the Somerville contract, I counted, I think, 22 things I thought was wrong with it. The indemnity provisions is one of it. Now, some things are just totally flat illegal, like the indemnity provisions. Other things were just, as a matter of policy, can't you see how this could go wrong? This doesn't obligate the developer to do anything, but it obligates the town. But this, so I'm saying the first thing you got to do is the devil's in the details. You got to look beyond the generalities. So maybe $20 million is good, but at what cost? At what risk?
That's right.
Okay, and let's start with what's the legal requirements to do this, okay?
That's the foundation
and what's
of everything.
the legal requirements criteria-wise and procedure-wise? That's the foundation for everything. That's exactly correct. So you're not going to be voting on concepts like whether this will help the community or not. But then the other thing I would say, just because the same people keep showing up doesn't mean what they advocate isn't correct.
Right.
And maybe we got a taxpayers association, so they send 1 or 2 members of the taxpayers association to make the same points. I would actually, ironically, I was a senator 13 years. I wanted to hear the opposition. Now, I didn't want to hear people that were overbearing or used profanity or unreasonable or nuts. I didn't want to hear that. But I want the pros and cons on the merits so I can make the decision of the trade-offs. And no matter how much I drill down, I can only know a certain amount of information. But I'm going to go beyond the rhetoric or just the narrative. It's like, what do you base that on? It's no better than what you base it on. So you say wearing ankle baskets will reduce crime by 50%. Well, what do you base that on? What makes you think that? Where do you get that? And a lot of times they're just operating on their narrative. And then actually they don't really even care about the criteria. They just care about the outcome they want. So I would actually, if I were a council member, welcome a responsible input, even if it's the same person each time. But this is what I call critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's really critical thinking. Are you... So every time I hear something, like when I see on the news, like TV by government officials, I mean, it's a point I just don't necessarily believe anything they're saying now, because there's been so much misinformation so long. But if I'm now responsible for voting, like a town councilman, then I want to know the pros and cons and what are the risks. And you do that by asking, but then what is that based on?
The fascinating thing at one of the last meetings, it was a pretty, you could tell the room was divided, and we were standing up, and I spoke on behalf of Preservation South Carolina's support for this. And a lot of people were very good and very articulate communicating to the council about why this was a bad idea. And there was a gentleman that stood up from the citizenry and came up there and basically just told them, I'm sick and tired of these people stopping things. You know what's right, communicating to council.
Right.
Just do it and don't get distracted with all these people trying to stop things.
Right.
And I'm sitting there going, what is your basis for thinking we can't have thoughtful debate on something that we just want to bully through because it makes you feel better? It's difficult for me to understand how to even approach that argument.
Well, actually, we see every day that the government, like now at the federal level, has an agenda, and they don't care about the collateral damage.
So let me ask you this. Since you've been doing this so long, I tend to see a concerted effort. I see almost what appears to be a playbook that is at play by developers. What are your thoughts on there being a playbook on how developers approach small towns and medium-sized towns that might not have the systems in place to guard against illegal activity to push their projects into it? What do you think about that?
I think that's what's happened here, is that whether it's Beaufort or Somerville or Aiken.
So what happened in Beaufort, too?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. They had some project there the citizen pushed back over, but I can't tell you whether it was a lawsuit or the one that, what I'm really most familiar with is Somerville and Aiken. But I have heard there's other towns that the same thing's being done. So they go and say, we need a boutique hotel. We need this, we need that. In Somerville, they said, we can do what we're doing because these other towns did it. Then I found out in depositions these other towns didn't do it, or they did it a different way. It wasn't the way we were doing it. So it was just a narrative that was stated without being factually accurate. But I think what's happened is there's real estate companies whose business, in order to make more money, target small towns and county councils to push their projects. And they study who's who and what's what and what the landscape is. And now the approach is, we got old stuff and we're going to replace it with new stuff. And it's just a niche business. And they go into all, like I said, there's over 200 municipalities. And
they know how to target those places that are soft targets.
Right, so that's all capitalism, and that's all, but it's no different than, say, the waste management company. They're going to target all we got waste, and we want to pick it up, and we want you to store it at our places, so now we got to go to town and county council members and figure out how to get a majority on our side to pick us. And so all goods and services, and the bigger the money in the aggregate, the bigger the incentive to
kind of find your way around.
Find your way around. That's right. So they will. It's sort of like to get your agenda. Well, we'll go ahead and get all the district attorneys in the country we can in the big towns that have a leftist viewpoint of criminology, so that they'll empty the prisons and let people go ahead and steal up the whatever the limit is without going to jail and so forth to push their agenda. They don't care about the collateral damage. Or they got an ideology or a mindset that makes them skip over the factors that we would consider.
Let me ask you this. Another element in here that happened that I was really amazed at was the town came in and purchased all these buildings. And again, they purchased this through a federal grant that was given to them. I mean, it wasn't like this came out of indigenous funds they raised within the tax base. They were handed millions of dollars from the federal government because of a suit regarding Savannah River plant and toxicity from nuclear waste. Right. And so they just had this pool of money and started saying, how can we spend it, basically. And they started buying up all these buildings. Well, these buildings had tenants in them. Now, I know some of these tenants were basically told, here, we will let you stay here, but you can't speak out against what we're trying to do.
Right.
That has to be unconstitutional.
Well, it is. It's unconstitutional. The government cannot condition a benefit on you giving up a constitutional right like the First Amendment.
And it was amazing because these people were, because I talked to some of them, and I say, they can't do that. And he says, I can't risk that pushing back because they can kick me out because I'm their tenant.
Right.
And it to me, that was the sign of the insidiousness of what was going on here.
Right.
To feel like they could do that to people that were functioning community and functioning businesses in the community in a place where all these stores were working, and they're saying they're trying to help economic development by building this new stuff where stuff's already working.
Right. So it comes down to, if you're an elected official, who do you represent? Do you represent all the people or special interests?
Right.
And they might dress up a narrative to convince themselves that, well, by representing the special interests desires, I'm really helping all the people. It's just collateral. Well, look, Hitler didn't think he was a bad guy. I mean, he had a rationale for all he did and convinced millions of people to buy into his narrative. So people you can almost always come up with a construct or some rationale and then convince other people. It doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean it's logical or reasonable at all.
Well, on a community level, I'm just trying to figure out how we can repair a system on a community level to where you can push. I mean, it's sad that it takes people to dig into resources to create lawsuits to correct the ship of state.
Right.
And that's what it took here. And thankfully, Aiken has a pool of folks who can do that.
Right.
A lot of towns don't, and a lot of towns get bulldozed over, unfortunately. And that's why I wanted us to have this discussion so we can talk about this. And I really appreciate your time doing that.
Well, thank you. But I think we should put this in perspective. No, it's not it's an imperfect system, and there's a lot of injustice and a lot of law breaking that get away with. But at least we live in a country where there's limits to it. And there's some latitude for pushback, as opposed to in Hong Kong, they're not getting much traction these days pushing back on anything, not to mention China. So
no system is perfect, but at least we have one. If you can find the resources, you can create pushback and right the ship a little bit.
Well, that's correct. And I like what's the lawsuit in Aiken and Somerville for its precedential value beyond Somerville and Aiken for the rest of the state. So
what happens here will now be on paper, and we can communicate, and then maybe attorneys in other towns can go, oh, wait a minute, let's think about this.
Well, it's like this 5-0 decision in the Supreme Court we got, saying that each issue in a referendum had to be voted on separately. That's the Ziegler case. So the plaintiff, Jerry Ziegler, is a retired Army sergeant. So I sat him down in my office after we won. Said, Jerry, here's the decision of the Supreme Court, 5-0, nothing, you won the Supreme Court. Now understand the significance of this. This means in the future, every municipality in the state, every county council, every public service district, every school district in the state itself is going to have a separate vote on each item, and instead of lumping them together to collect money from bonds in a referendum. And the people in the government are going to ask the lawyers, well, why do we have to separate it? And the answer is always going to be because of the Ziegler decision. So long after you and I are gone, all of these entities are going to have to follow the Ziegler decision. When it registered what I was saying, he says, hey, that's cool. And I said, yeah, that is cool, Jerry. That exactly. So we can't clean it all up, but we can target. We're fighting the battle where we can. And the things are aligned in Somerville and in Aiken. And whether life is, one thing leads to another. So I say engage, 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 but don't put off till tomorrow what you do today, because one thing leads to another, like this interview. So at least this is cyclical. This is like a gold rush or a silver rush historically in our country. Everybody's coming to it. Well, here it's real estate. Okay, so whoever gets their projects approved and builds gets rich. But if you look at Somerville, a year after the contracts were signed, the developer's suing the town for $8 million, and they're still in the lawsuits. 5 years later, they're still suing each other on the project we sued on. Our lawsuit's still pending. So what if they had built part of this, torn down everything and built part of it, and it's half built, and now they're suing each other? Plus, COVID came. How many people are going to be coming to the hotel or the conference center with COVID?
Well, again, it tends to all to be about the short-term gratification of quick money, and
certain people,
for certain narrow group
at the expense of the masses, the taxpayer. That's exactly correct.
That's right.
So most people are living paycheck to paycheck. My philosophy is let everybody keep their money as much as possible. On the other hand, somebody who's more socialistic or believes in government, they think the government can decide better about your children, about how you spend your money, so they get all the money they can so they can spend it on the projects for your good.
So that comes to a good point, because many people who push back on communities like this, who say, we don't want you to just destroy things, they tend to see that as government getting involved with capitalism, because here's a capitalistic group coming in and wanting to invest and make money, and the government is stopping it. But I keep reminding these folks, the government is a representation of the community. Government is not some alien that just landed
That's
here.
right.
It is a reflection of the community through representation that put them there and created policies that the community wanted.
Right.
Then you have government officials come and go, and then you get some government officials that have a different philosophy,
Right.
and then want to alter that, but can't through regular places, and they try to push it over.
But in addition to that, at least in the case of Somerville, this often happens, is that the so-called private projects being subsidized by money from the government anyway.
Yeah, they're helping to underwrite it.
They're underwriting it. They could only make the hotel condominium conference center complex in Somerville work if they got such substantial tax breaks that they could never make it just as a private enterprise. It had to have government subsidies. And what they actually did in Somerville is they loaned them money. They gave them money. So it was like having a partner, a financial partner. Now, this is really bad there. Now, it's bad in Aiken, but for different reasons. But what I'm saying is it's not like the government was hands off. The government was
subsidizing it.
Was subsidizing. It was a de facto partner.
Right. So, Mike, thank you so much for all this time. Do you have any last thoughts that you want to get in a point?
Well, I would just say anybody listening to this is that we have so many benefits in this country compared to the rest of the world that it's worth fighting for, and each individual can only do so much given whatever talents you have, whatever money you have, whatever time you have, but everybody can do something and fight the battle from where they are to preserve the rule of law and to influence the government to make prudent decisions. So I would urge everybody to proactively do what they can and not feel like or conclude that, well, it's hopeless, so what's the use? Because our country's gone through many ailments in the past, with wars, insurrections, depression, even violence, and we've been resilient. We've survived, but it's because of the will of people and the proactivity to be involved as citizens. So there's really a kind of a moral imperative for everybody to do what they can to preserve these great freedom benefits that we have.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you so much.
Okay.
And thank you for all your life of service to the rule of law, and especially doing that here in South Carolina. That's awesome. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
All right.
I represent probably 100 people in the military in the last 2 years to keep them from being thrown out of the military for not taking the COVID vaccine.
Wait a minute. Say that again.
Well, I use the law to try to benefit people in many ways. I represent a lot of people in the military, and I've represented probably 100 people in the last 2 years to prevent them from being thrown out of the military for not taking the COVID vaccine when they have religious objections to it. I've kept cadets from being thrown out of 4 academies, for example. And 6 federal courts have sided now with us that the government, the military illegally denied religious exemption requests, for example. I'm just using this as another example, and there's many, many, many examples of where I'm able to use the law to protect people and to help people. But everybody, so you're not a lawyer, fine, but everybody can exert political influence in their way, and they can band together and help shape events.
So this reminds me, I just want to make this comment about the rule of law versus political ideology,
right?
And how important the rule of law is. And I love bringing back up this issue that is rooted in our foundation, that every school child was taught how the Boston Massacre was the event that helped spark the revolution, that these British soldiers fired on these innocent people in Boston and killed these people, and how that helped spark our revolution. But what is never taught is the fact that even though Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty were pushing this somewhat mobism, right, his cousin John Adams
got them all,
was the man who defended the right British soldiers and found them all innocent, right, and he was able to point across the water to Parliament and say, we will be a country where the rule of law right matters, right, and we are not a mob.
Right.
And that's the basis of who we are. And we can affect the laws. We can change the laws. But we can't just have laws and then just decide which ones to adhere to and how to use political pressure to deny them.
And which ones to enforce or not enforce.
That's right. Yeah. So thank you for all the work you've done to ensure they're enforced equally and protecting the citizens of this wonderful country. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. This is part 3 of our series, Community Sovereignty. And this final episode in this series is interviewing a friend of the show, Mr. Donovan Rypkema, a leader in creating economic modeling and proving the viability of historic preservation and how it helps lead to more sustainable economic activity and more vibrancy and better investment. It is an amazing opportunity that we have for Donovan to come along and share with us his thoughts on why these type of systems matter in protecting the community's ability to protect their historic fabric. So let's get right into it. Hello, everybody. We have a very special episode as part of our perspective focus on community development. And we are very proud to have with us a dear friend of the organizations that I've worked with and someone that I've always looked up to, who is the expert in place economics, which is the name of his company, which he travels all over the world communicating to cities and communities the importance of preserving historic fabric for economic viability. And I'm so proud to have Donovan Rypkema here with us today. Hello, Donovan.
Hey, Mike, great to be with you. Congratulations on the first versions of the podcast. It looks wonderful.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And, you know, I wanted you to come in because we were fortunate enough to be able to bring you down. Your office is in Washington, D.C., and you're a very busy man with your company traveling all over the world. Anybody that looks at your webpage, Place Economics, you'll see you travel everywhere communicating and doing studies about the economics of preserving historic fabric. And we were fortunate enough to have a roundtable in Aiken at the whole debate issue about what's happening in downtown Aiken with the potential destruction of half a city block of historic buildings for new built um, buildings and new construction. And we had a great roundtable that you participated in, as well, Christopher King, who's going to be on this show. But I want to talk to you. I want to go right into kind of one, I want to go into your background a little bit on what you're doing and what your work is like around the world, and what your office days are like on what you do.
Well, we are a small firm, and we're a virtual firm. There's six of us, and we live in six different cities. Um, and our work is about two thirds, one third on the domestic side, and that two thirds of it is analytical, looking at measuring the impact of historic preservation or something similar to that. All the work we do, whatever we do, is at the intersection of historic preservation and economics. So a lot of that is these studies. So some of the impact, we just are finishing a study in Frankfort, Kentucky, about the impacts of historic preservation there. We're about halfway through one in Columbia, South Carolina, just starting a study of the 10-year history of Alabama Main Street. Just finished up a series of recommendations for the city of Phoenix. So two thirds of it is analytical, measuring impacts. The other third of it is policy recommendations, tools, strategies, incentives, policies to primarily encourage the private sector investment into historic uh, buildings. So that's kind of what our work is. The international side of that is a bit different in that there's more kind of capacity building, training, and less of the analytical stuff.
Gotcha. So your big takeaway and your life's work, can you summarize kind of,
Mm.
because I kind of see it as a predictable outcome because of me working in preservation for so long and seeing these studies and seeing the impact of preservation ethos in cities. What is your big takeaway that you normally tell people when they say, why is preservation good?
Well, to some extent, you may be right, Mike. Maybe it's predictable or predictable to you, but a lot of our work we see is kind of myth busting. And there's often lots of preconceptions of what preservation does or doesn't do. They simply are not right. And so I think a big use of our study work is to say, yeah, what you're thinking is true, just ain't true. Um, but
What?
what is true about historic preservation and economics? When you talk about the building process, simply restoring buildings, it's an extraordinarily labor intensive process. And so it means jobs, but it means more jobs, 20% or so more jobs in the community than the same amount of money spent on new construction. So you start out you don't have to care about gargoyles and cornices. Just say, I don't care about anything but jobs and labor income. Then you ought to be a big proponent of historic preservation because that's what it provides. Second area. And it's interesting in the years I've been doing it, is the whole argument has reversed. It used to be that opponents of creating local historic districts would say, well, that's one more layer of regulation, and one more layer of regulation means prima facie an adverse impact on property value. So we're against local historic districts. Well, over the last 30 years, the one area that's been studied more than any other, and we've done a lot, but others have done a lot well, with more methodologies by different people, different places of the country, is this issue of the impact of local historic districts, so an additional local regulation on property values, and far from it being a hamper or a hindrance to property values. In fact, it's had the other effect in virtually every study that's been made, that in fact the rate of property value increase is greater in those protected local areas than they are in the rest of the real estate market. What's interesting, Mike, is that in many cases, the same human beings who 20 years ago said, don't give us a stupid historic district, it's going to hurt our property values, are now saying, don't give us a stupid historic district, property values are going to go up and I'll have to pay more taxes. So yeah, but it's just a consistent pattern. Then there's the area of the important role of of historic buildings and historic rehabilitation into successful downtown revitalization programs. I defy you to show me a sustained success story in downtown revitalization, big city, small town, anything in between, that didn't have a key component as historic preservation. The big failures are mostly those that say, we don't need those stupid old buildings, mow them down so we can have some, glassy something go in its place. And
So,
then, go ahead,
oh,
Mike.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, what I was going to dovetail into that is the what happened in 2008 with property values just gutting because of the speculative nature of what had happened to real estate the previous 10 years.
Mhm.
Explain what was the outcome of how historic districts hedged against that.
Well, it's really interesting in that with a couple very interesting outcomes. One, in every place we've looked. And now it's not that that historic neighborhoods were immune to the downturn; they took a hit. But every place we've looked at this issue, including this most recent study in Frankfurt, the decline was shallower, the recovery began sooner, and the recovery was greater than the rest of the market. So it's not that it didn't take a hit, but vastly less than the rest of the market, and the recovery was sooner and stronger. The other thing related to that I think people ought to be paying attention to, and we've now looked at, I don't know, 30 or 35 cities. We looked at rates of foreclosure in those local historic districts. And here we had this horrible, the Great Recession, and millions of American families lost everything that they had built up because they lost their home to foreclosure. Huge tragedy. But in every place we've looked, the foreclosure rate in local historic districts was significantly, measurably lower than it was in the rest of the city. We've looked at big cities, we looked at middle sized, we looked at small cities, and the answer is universally the same: is foreclosure rates are lower. Now, why is that? Well, I can only kind of speculate. Um, it's not that people who live in historic districts never get fired or get divorced or run up their credit card bills too much. I think what it is this: is if I get in financial trouble, even in a down market, I can get that property sold before it goes to foreclosure process. Meaning there's this latent demand for properties in historic districts that is strong even in weak markets, and so I can kind of get out from under if needs be. So this, and people would be paying attention. If this was this international crisis and this huge cost to American families, especially of middle class and modest means, then, and if local historic districts was a big mitigator of that, somebody ought to be paying attention to that.
So there was another issue in it that I kind of believe is the market rewards predictability. And where you have a neighborhood where it is predicted what can happen to that neighborhood. When you're driving down the street and you have this beautiful aesthetic of historic houses along the sidewalk with the trees, if those are protected with an ordinance, you know your investment is going to be protected. That if you're investing in this 4,000 square foot Victorian Queen Anne in a neighborhood of them, they won't necessarily be disappearing into turning into something else or turning into multi-housing and things like that. So,
Yeah, Mike, I think that's exactly right. What I often tell preservation commissioners, I said, sorry to break your heart, but that we refer to it as the preservation premium is paid in those neighborhoods. Well, that premium doesn't come about because I'm thrilled to go appear before your goofy preservation commission. The reason that premium comes is the confidence, exactly what you said, the confidence that I have that the lunatic across the street is not going to be able to do something to his property that has an adverse impact on the value of mine.
that's true. So, um, what? So let's go to Aiken just to talk about that because you were down there and you saw that. And in Aiken, I see a trend of commercial development ethos that these things are getting in the way, and a lot of people are listening to that. These things meaning these overlays, and like you even mentioned, the goofy historic commission, or that can tend to be seen as more of a marginalized group of people trying to keep other people from doing what they think they should be able to do.
Yeah.
Have you seen that trend happening, and what do you think is pushing that trend to undermine local sovereignty on their own historic commissions?
Well, it's not universal. It certainly happens someplace, and the kind of political strength of the development community will impact, how high a priority that attitude comes. But I think you need to step back from that. A false choice that's presented that preservationists and others have to spend time dissuading, and that is this false choice of either we're going to have economic development or we're going to have historic preservation.
Hmm.
Absolutely a fallacious false choice that we ought to be thinking, how come I'm in the economic development business, I'm all for economic development, but we ought to be thinking, how do we do economic development through historic preservation using historic buildings as opposed to viewing them as counter. That's point one. Point two is this, that in the vast majority of towns and cities, maybe 3, maybe 5, maybe 8% of the land area of the city is under the purview of the real estate commission or of the preservation commission. 90 or 92 or 95% isn't. Well, if you're not smart enough to figure out how to do your goofy building in the other 95% of the land, then maybe you're not smart enough to be in the real estate development business. I mean, you have the whole city to work with, for God's sake. Now, what's interesting is in the case in Aiken, but lots of other places too, it's that the developers say, yeah, that's the preservation ordinance, that's getting in my way. I refer to those as parasite buildings,
Hmm.
in that they want to take advantage of the quality, the character, the attractiveness of those districts. They just don't want to have to comply. In fact, we did a study a few years ago in New York City, where, of course, the Real Estate Board of New York is, always on hard charge. We've got to weaken these preservation rules. The very developers that would be saying, and their organization saying, this is hampering our development, we can't do what we need to do, once they get their gazillion-dollar building built, what does their advertising say? Oh, it's a walking distance from this and that historic district. Those are the parasites. They're taking advantage of it. And then the third element in this, again, one of the metrics that we frequently look at in these studies, we look at 10 or 15 years, as long as we can get as far as we can get the data, and we look at the pattern of turn downs, of denials by the local preservation commission. I've never seen it more than 5% of the applications. Usually it's one. In Frankfurt, where we're coming from, is over the last decade, over 3/4 of the applications for a certificate of appropriateness, the phrase for getting permission to do what you want to do in the historic district, over 75% of them were decided at the staff level, so you didn't even have to go to the commission, and that over the course of the year, 1% of the projects were turned down. Well, that's hardly a barrier to development when 99% of all the projects get approved either by staff or by the commission. So it's a fake argument.
Well, I would argue that here in, especially in South Carolina, one of my other interviews with the attorney Mike Rose, talked about how South Carolina is in the middle of the biggest real estate rush it has ever happened in the
Mm-hmm.
past 10 years, and there has been such outside corporate pressure coming into these communities that's not local developers, that doesn't have the same ethos, and it's really about coming in and making quick deals happen quick. um, I did want to go back to your concept of, like, in Frankfurt in the historic districts. What amazes me about European cities is you look at the aerial view of a European city now, like London, and you have the whole downtown, you have the whole center core with Westminster Abbey and the Tower of London and the whole city. And way off in the distance, you have the huge high rises outside the old historic core. For some reason, in America and in South Carolina specifically, in all other big cities, they had such a cult of Main Street that they had to put all these buildings down on Main Street and not create a new city outside of the thing to keep the historic part there. And that we still see that happening. What was happening in Aiken. And you're right, it is kind of a parasitic thing that to go in where people already are, instead of creating something good enough that people would come to anyway, wherever it is.
Yeah.
And in this day and time, economics will flow wherever quality is. I mean, you got to get in your car and you can go anywhere.
Well, I think there's another element of that, and it's another reason from the economic development standpoint to argue for historic preservation. I mean, I'm in the economics business, and it's product differentiation
Mm.
that creates a monetary premium. And that's true of towns and cities and buildings as well. So every time a decision is made in your community, forget preservation for a minute, every time a decision is made, the people should be asking themselves, is this decision to say yay to this, whatever it is that making us more distinctive or more like every place else? And if the answer is the second, then you ought to rethink the proposal. Nobody nobody travels to, nobody chooses to live someplace that's exactly like where they're from. That's the whole point of it. It was exactly the same as your place. Why the hell would you ever go there? So it's this distinctiveness that adds monetary premium, and so it should be with great reluctance that we ever make a decision that makes our town more like as opposed to less like other places.
Could you go into the economics of the modern development model that appears to be planned obsolescence? It appears to be where instead of the economics of investors investing in a long-term investment that will build capital for the community and themselves, it appears to be just something where people are going in, taking off a slice of the pie, and then getting out of the way and let the community deal with what's left. Is
That's
that
right.
a fair look at this?
It is, and it's referred to as merchant developers that were I'm building something to hold for a short time and flip it, turn it. So it is not. If you think about the buildings in built a century ago or you know 4 or 5 decades ago, they were built with the conscious aim of saying this: I'm going to make this investment for a long term return. And because real estate is a capital heavy asset, is that I build a building of a quality that will generate revenues for a long time. That was the whole purpose. And you don't build crappy buildings with the expectation that they'll last a long time. So people consistently, and I don't mean all grand mansions or great, 1920s Art Deco skyscrapers. I mean the buildings up and down your street were quality buildings with the anticipation that they were going to be around to generate income for generations. This reversal of that is to say, and it has a couple of effects. Is one, I'll just take the blueprints that I used in 14 other towns and plop them down here, and so it's a destroyer of local differentiation and character. But it also is, I'm gonna buy the existing property. I'm going to get construction loan, build the building. I'll get the first swing at a permanent loan, and then I'll get out of this deal, sell it to some real estate investment trust or pension fund or whatever pot of money and leave. And so my margin where I make my money is in the flip, is in putting together the package. And I don't mean that you don't deserve to make money putting together a development package. You certainly do. But traditionally, it was putting together that package and then the long term revenue stream that was the value measure for the building. Now it's mostly how cheaply can I build it relative to how much I can sell it for. That's going to be my margin. I'm getting out of this place. So my commitment to any town is a couple of years, not a couple of decades. And it just changes the whole. And think about that, Mike. If you're building knowing you're going to be around 30 years from now, you're going to build it differently than if you build it to be around only 3 years from now. And that's what happens with these buildings being built.
And when you say 3 years from now, you're talking about the investors that have capitalized it to get their capital back out in 3 years.
Absolutely
Right.
right. Absolutely right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the most disturbing thing about this that a lot of people don't understand because when we're in these buildings debating how to stop a certain type of development, there's a myth within the bigger community, a very well meaning group of people who want economic development that think what these people are doing is the same that all developers in town have always done.
Well,
And
it,
it's
it,
just not
it,
the case.
it's just not at all. The other thing, though, let's pretend for a minute you don't care about historic preservation at all. That's fine. You don't have to. But instead, you care about the environment. building these buildings with relatively short lives, and I mean 20 instead of 100, has a gargantuan negative environmental impact. You can have all the green gizmos and LEED certifications you want, but if you're throwing away that building in 15 or 20 or 25 years, you have totally wiped out any environmental savings that all your goofy gizmos created. That this building of disposable buildings has a gargantuan environmental cost.
The other thing is, and this is about municipalities getting economically involved in the development of the community, with the creation of nonprofit development corps, which have worked extraordinarily well in many cities, like what happened in Columbia, South Carolina, with the Vista. I mean, that was done by the Columbia Development Corp that helped make investment safer in a risky area. At least it was very risky in the 80s to do that. I was speaking to a gentleman there that was involved in the development of what was going on in Aiken with Project Pascalis to destroy half that block and build all this. And I made mention about how I thought it was foolish that the town came in through the Development Corp and raised a bond to pay for the hotel building, probably 3 times what its true market value was. And he justified it because the ability to grab hold and the timeliness of getting hold of all those properties at once was what made it so valuable to the development of what they wanted to do. And I was shocked that there was that sense of thinking paying more for it is good with taxpayer money. That's a whole nother issue. But the other element is this, and it's kind of our corporate world now. We have this sense of economy of scale and consolidating resources. And they saw all these individual stores as an impediment to bigger economic development with a bigger place. Why is bigger not better?
Well, sometimes bigger is better.
Mm-hmm.
But see, here again, it's setting up the wrong argument. Let's say, for the sake of argument, in Aiken, I kind of don't want to get in the weeds about Aiken. I just don't know enough about that. But let's pretend that the proposed development in Aiken was really going to be, it's going to be a quality building built for the long term, generate jobs, generate tax revenues, all the reasons that a local development organization ought to be involved. Then the question is, why there? Why there? There's lots of places in Aiken that you could make that decision, and not wiping down half a block of historic buildings, including the corner building with a great African American connection history in Aiken. Why there? If this was such a good idea, maybe it is, right? Maybe it is a good idea, this hotel. Then find a place where you can do that. I'm telling you, that hotel 4 blocks away will have the same number of jobs created, tax revenues, blah, 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 that it's going to have at the proposed in that corner. So the issue is not, oh, it's a bad idea, it's a good idea. It's a bad idea in that place.
What is the economic impact of the loss of expertise on these buildings? When that you have you been able to measure that? Because when inevitably we meet with these folks, they say our engineers say it can't stand. Yeah. Our building thing it can't, and it usually takes me. I can count on my hand the engineers, and I count on my hand with one finger. The engineer I know can come in and communicate with knowledge why this masonry building is perfectly sound, where 9 other engineers said no.
Yep.
You see that as a universal thing of loss of that skill set?
It is, and sometimes not just the loss, the absence of it. But it's a universal, and on a whole range of skills. But that's particularly has an adverse effect, Mike, as you say, when it's the structural engineers who come in. And so some developer could say, "I'd love to do something, but my guy says nothing we can do with that." Interesting you should mention Charleston, because of Joe Riley's long tenure there. He just refuses to accept that as an answer. And the reason that Charleston is the high quality place that it is because they said we don't throw away these buildings. Period. 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 Don't be telling me we can't do anything with it. We can do something with it, and that has to be the approach. And again, you're right. We need the kind of professional skill set to be able to get past the BS about it's going to fall down tomorrow.
Well, one of the conversations that'll be part of this program that you haven't heard yet was my conversation with Christopher King. And what has happened with the erosion of overlays in Charleston is frankly a little horrifying. And I've never spoken to the preservation elite in Charleston that has been so proud of what they've been able to do for the past 50 years and a culture of maintaining things, and how that's eroded to where Charleston is in danger
Yeah,
now
yeah.
because of this same corporate outside money, corporate hedge funds that are coming in and underwriting all these huge global projects.
It is, and what's again, it's a step removed from what we've been talking about. But what's particularly happening in Charleston, and I don't mean that you're not right that the overlay districts themselves are being weakened, but this scale of the development might be outside the district itself, but has this great negative visual impact
Mm-hmm.
on the city. And there's, I don't know how esoteric you want to get, but there's a UNESCO protocol that was adopted maybe 10 or 12 years ago called the Historic Urban Landscape. And here's what it's based. And the first time I heard about it, I asked the guy from UNESCO who kind of wrote it. I said, "Well, these are talking about buildings. Why are you talking about landscape?" And he said, "Well, here's the reason." He said, "If you think about the natural landscape, it's always in change. Always, trees are growing, leaves are falling down, grass grows, grass withers." He said, "We need to think about cities like that. Cities are never fixed. They're never in stasis. There's always change. And so our approach in heritage conservation needs to be to manage that change."
Mm.
And that's how we need to think about it. So it's not that there can't be any new development; it's that we need to do whatever's going to happen in the context of the whole. Having said all that, the reason I bring up the historic urban landscape is it was driven. The creation at UNESCO of that was driven by Vienna, Austria. Wonderful, wonderful historic center, World Heritage Site Center. They had around it a buffer zone saying you can't build in the buffer zone. So it looked like everything was protected. And then 2 inches past the edge of the buffer zone, proposals for gargantuan buildings that would have had a huge impact, negative impact on the view shed. And Vienna risked the loss of its World Heritage status because of that. And that was really what motivated UNESCO to say we need to rethink. We can't just saying, okay, you got a World Heritage site now, freeze everything in place, because that doesn't work.
Right.
And so how do we then manage the change over time? I'll give you the other example with the same kind of situation. St. Petersburg, Russia is one of the most beautiful cities in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And the river runs at the edge of the city, and Gazprom, the gargantuan petroleum company in Russia, was building a new headquarters building. And to their credit, they held a big international design competition for designing this new headquarters building. And I happened to be in St. Petersburg when these were on display. So they had models of these,
Wow.
and and it was fabulous. And clearly, almost any one of them, if they were built, would have been the earliest landmarks of the 21st century. They were gorgeous. I mean, modern buildings, but gorgeous, gorgeous, imaginative, creative buildings. But where they were planning them right across the river from the old city, so that the average of them were 8 or 10 times as tall as the highest building in the old city of St. Petersburg. Same arguments being used in Aiken, saying, but this is a corporate headquarters. It's going to be lots of jobs and lots of economic development. Blah blah blah. Yes, true. 4 kilometers away, it could have same buildings being built with no impact on the city. So once again, this kind of attitude of being a parasite, we want to take advantage of that. We want to take but not give. It's a kind of international problem.
Yeah. Well, Donovan, thank you so much for taking so much time. Do you have any other thoughts that maybe questions I didn't ask or thoughts in to kind of encapsulate
Well, no,
this?
only one, Mike, and that's I'm very happy that you didn't raise the question of heritage tourism. And here's the reason: heritage, we're all for it; it's good. But my life's goal is to get past the point when somebody says, you hear the phrase historic preservation and economics in the same sentence. The response is, "Oh, you must be talking about heritage tourism." Yes, it's a big thing, and heritage visitors spend more per day, they stay longer, visit more places, all kinds of incremental economic benefits. But my goal is to get people to understand, yeah, that's one, but that's out of a dozen ways that historic preservation is good for your local economy.
Yeah, it definitely is. And what makes, to go back to the specific issue of Aiken, what makes that so magnificent example is so many towns can't afford to get the resources together to try to push back on these things. And Aiken is one of those towns in the state that has resources within the citizenry that have moved there specifically intentionally to be part of a community that they were impressed by and really just didn't want to see that ethos change on them. And I love the point about not putting everything under glass, because one of the problems with historic commissions is there many of these folks are there for the passion of saving things, but they need to be more educated on that concept of change and moving. The National Park Service has a thing called period of significance. And sometimes that term gets very tiresome because it tends to think you have to freeze something. And that's one of the things I've been pushing back against personally, because these buildings have to live and they have to tell a story. There are so many buildings on the National Register that show 5 generations of change, and all of those things is significant. But if the certain protections had been in place any time along those changes, the changes would not have happened, thus giving its historical significance now. So we need to learn to let these places breathe and let the communities breathe with change, but understand what is important and how to get consensus on that. And that's what this whole discussion is about.
You're absolutely right.
So thanks again. It was always great to see you. I hope next time you're down here in South Carolina, give a ring. And we love to see you down here in this state, or I'll see you when I get up to Washington. And everybody, again, remember: place, purpose, preservation. Take care.